Hey, welcome back. We're on part 2 of building our new jetpack here. So today we're going to talk about the worst part of the process, which is, of course, sanding. Sanding takes up a lot of time, so we're just going to get right to it. So let's get started. What we've done so far is off camera, just to speed the process up, I have already sanded every single piece for the most part of the jetpack build. However, I did save the rocket, and the reason why I saved the rocket is because it's not a quick and simple flat piece to sand. So I'm going to show you the process of what we do, and then we're going to go into doing some glazing with photosensitive resin, and then we're going to move on to sanding that off again. So a couple quick things to note. When I do the sanding of this, I do leave the caps on and assembled to the cylinders when I do my initial sanding of the cap. I then remove the cap and do another sanding. So let's walk through the process on this rocket of how we actually go from this to no print lines. Let's get started on that. Alright, so our initial pass is going to be with an 80 grit sandpaper. I do use a random orbit sander. It does speed things up. However, when you're using 80 grit, you do have to be very careful not to dig into it and gouge it. And I'll try to give a demonstration. I let the sander do the work. I do not bear down on that at all, because we don't want to melt the plastic and you don't want to stay in one spot for very long. Alright, so as you can see, we've hit it with the 80 grit sandpaper first. All we're doing with the 80 grit is just roughing it up. There's still some spots in here that still need to be hand sanded slightly. We want to make sure we don't get down into any of this lower part, because we don't want to tear up the knurling there that's printed. And there's going to be some print lines on here temporarily until we get some filler on it. And then same way with the top. We're doing most of our work with the 220 grit. So we go straight from 80 to 220. All we're doing is knocking off what we did with the 80 grit. So we're skipping a few steps on this part of the process first. So the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to get some hand sandpaper, and I'm just going to clean up any edges and areas that I can't get to. Mostly I'm just going to focus on right here. I'm not worried about this bottom collar yet, because the glazing is actually going to take care of that. And we've still got some marks on the cone as well. We're not going to get too stressed about those yet. This initial pass is simply made so that we can get the high spots taken care of. It's like that on any piece that we sand. We're hitting it with the 80 to get the high spots off, following it up with the 220 just to smooth out, to see where our trouble areas are, so that we can focus our glazing on there. So let's get some glaze, some photosensitive glazing and resin, and let's get started on that part. Alright, I got all my tools ready to do this next step. The first thing we're going to do is make sure that we have a paintbrush. I just use the same paintbrush pretty much all the time. As long as you keep it out of the UV light, it's really not going to cure or have any problems. I've got some resin here in a cup that I keep separate from all of my other 3D prints that I do on my Elegoo, and I can't tell you exactly what kind of resin I'm using here. Probably Elegoo brand, but there's probably 10 different kinds mixed in with this black. So I always keep a bottle that is just for this type of project. The last thing you're going to need is a UV light. Now we do have, as you can see here in the background, we do have a UV curing station back there, but when I'm doing this type of work, I actually use the light. So let's get started on this. The key to this, less is more. You don't want to just cover this stuff. I mean, there's plenty of YouTube videos out there that show this process, but I'm going to pull our somewhere to set these down on so that they don't stick to my workbench. And we're just going to get a little bit of glazing of resin on there. And obviously you can see I'm wearing gloves. This stuff is pretty nasty, and I'm not a big fan of getting it on my skin. So precautions are always a good idea. And once we got it painted on there, we're now going to take the UV light, keeping it away from the bottle or everything else over there, and we're just going to give it a quick cure so we don't get any runs in it. So now that that piece is done, I'm actually happy with that. We're going to set that aside, and we're going to move on to the next part of the rocket here. I am going to focus on this base area down here without getting it any drips or runs as best we can. And then I'm actually going to stop at this collar, cure it, and then focus on this bottom half. Looks pretty good. Go ahead and get this curing. Let's flip this over and work on this lower area down here. I'm going to get a smaller brush for this. Just using an old chip brush. Don't have very much on my brush at this point. And I'm going to drag it around the bottom as best we can, staying out of this knurling here. We do not want to lose any detail on that. Since there are a lot of print lines around this bottom piece, I'm just dabbing it on there. Goes right into the lines. It looks pretty good. So before it starts running, let's get that cured. All right, looks pretty good. Now let's go over to the, today we're gonna cheat a little bit. I'm gonna set these parts out in the sun for a little bit and just let the sun do the work. It's not too hot outside today, so it should cure them here in about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll be back for the next step. Our parts have sat outside in the sun. What I did, sun's coming down. They sat there for about 5 minutes on one side. I rotated it 5 minutes on the other side. Now here's the part about working with the resin. Yes, the sun is going to cure it. And yes, it is still sticky and tacky and you don't want to handle it. But here's what I do. You can either get some isopropyl alcohol, spray it down real good, wipe it off. We have a cleaning station here. I just throw it back into my sonic cleaner in this particular case. So I'm going to drop these in back here, let them sit for 5 minutes. Then we're going to stick them back out in the sun for another 2 or 3 minutes, back into the cleaning station, and they should be good to go and ready for sanding. All right, out of the alcohol bath, cleaned it up. I did have to spray and wipe a couple areas because they were still a little sticky. Got it all cleaned up. Rinse and repeat. If you need to stick it out in the sun or in a UV curing station for a little bit, that's fine. Stick it back out or stick it back into the isopropyl alcohol or spray it on. That's what I do with the body. Just keep going back and forth until it's no longer sticky to the touch. So now we're going to get our sander back out at the 220 grit and we're going to resand these pieces, and hopefully this will be the final sanding. All right, moved over after I used my random orbit sander with the 220 grit. I have now moved over to a 400 grit and just hit any spots that I thought potentially could cause some problems when we went over to paint. Everything looks good. I did not sand this area down here. It is still glazed and I think we're going to be fine. A shot of primer is going to tell us that here in just a moment. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to prep all these parts for paint. I've got my isopropyl alcohol. We'll spray it down real quick. Wipe them off. Make sure we get every dust particle that we can off of it so that the paint doesn't peel off later if we use any masking tape. And that should get us to the next stage. Now comes the priming stage. The priming stage is it's my least favorite thing to do, because you think you get all these parts nice and smooth, you go hit it with the primer, and then who knows what's going to happen. So stay with us for next week when we move over and start doing some priming. Again, guys, thanks. Leave a comment below. Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video.